determination to make, but thank you very much. But we will, as you mentioned, begin in the room with Jim Bronskill of the Canadian Press.
Good afternoon. Concerning the protocol and the panel, I'm trying to divine whether there's any change from the last time in terms of the threshold, or is it identical to the 2021 election in terms of a threshold for having a public announcement?
Turn that over to you, Al.
Yeah, so thanks very much for the question. I would say that each election is slightly different because the context in which it operates is different. In this case, the panel's threshold, as Lorianne correctly explained, remains high for panel announcements. But I think what you also heard from her is a greater involvement of the Government of Canada as a whole in engaging transparently on issues where there might be mis or disinformation. So while the panel announcement remains a very high threshold, I think you'll see a more active Government of Canada response, and that response is in fact organized by the panel in their various capacities as senior leaders of the public service, but also in their mandate as part of the Caretaker Convention.
We recently saw a couple examples, perhaps during the Liberal leadership campaign. Is that the sort of thing that you're alluding to, the kind of announcements about the rapid response mechanism in Ms. Freeland's campaign? That's sort of public pronouncement?
Very much so. In fact, if you go even further back at the various by-elections that occurred, the previous Prime Minister activated site for the last 12 or 13 by-elections. And in that process, you saw instances where the government stepped forward and called out different types of foreign interference. Again, during the Liberal leadership, where the site was again activated, you saw again a public announcement of an example of foreign interference. This is really an example that we hope has test run the approach that we'll use for this election.
Melanie Marquis.
Oui, bonjour.
Hello. I'll start with the obvious question. Elon Musk, owner and ally of Donald Trump, have you already found proof that there is interference from him? And what is your message for social media owners generally? I'll begin, and then Al and Larissa can answer. Mr. Musk, or anyone else, working under him does not fall into the category of foreign interference. Would you like to add something else?
Your example is a very timely one. Obviously, Mr. Musk has considerable following not just in Canada, but throughout the world. It's an expression of his personal opinion. It's definitely not clandestine. It's very public by its very nature. And you know, Canadians will have an opportunity to judge his or anyone else's opinions as expressed throughout the election campaign. And so our trust is with Canadians that they can separate what is truthful and what may not be truthful, and what should be listened to and what should be ignored.
Oui, je suis tout à fait.
I'm well aware that the simple fact of expressing himself does not represent electoral interference. However, Mr. Musk controls the algorithms. Have you found any indications that lead you to believe that algorithms have been manipulated to get his message out?
Thank you.
I don't think.
Where?
I think it will just turn on.
I think it will just turn on. Is it on? Yes. When we see online activity, that has the markings of inauthentic behavior or manipulated, that something is manipulated, we will, from at the rapid response mechanism in Canada, our analysts are able to look at the data behind the social media posts, the social media activity, to see what it's connected to and what it's linked to. And if we see the markers of a foreign-backed, in particular a state-backed campaign, we will flag that through the mechanisms that both Lori and Vanessa have described. And we watch all the platforms that you can think of.
You ready?
Yeah, my question was going to be actually about that as well, specifically about the platform X. Is there any strategy to tackle with the bots? And because that's one big source of spreading disinformation specifically. And how do you hope Canadians to kind of make a difference between fake profiles and bots on social media platforms?
So there are a variety of approaches that are undertaken and have been undertaken. For instance, the Government of Canada has funded for some years now the Canadian Digital Media Research Networks, which is an independent network of Canadian think tanks that looks at issues such as bots. In fact, they had a year ago last summer, there was the Kirkland Lake incident, which was an example of the use of bots to amplify a presentation by one of the political leaders. And they identified it correctly and identified that, in fact, there was a bit of amplification that had taken place. It wasn't a particularly meaningful or substantive amplification, but they were able to detect it. This network is now a year older. It has some 10 think tanks and academic institutions tied to it, with more joining as affiliates. And it will be independently of the government, be looking at issues such as the one you raised about the use of bots to amplify. And if I could just take a step back, keep in mind that this is not a uniquely Canadian phenomenon. This is something that affects democracies around the world. And as Lori-Ann, I think, mentioned, Canada is not, in fact, like at the very front lines of this issue. So just as all other democracies have had, significant democratic events that have had integrity over the last year or so, including many of our allies, there's every reason to believe Canada will as well.
Yes.
Al is correct that we're very lucky in Canada to have a growing civil society becoming increasingly active in identifying foreign interference and other malign activity online. But there was also made reference to materials that have been circulated today, and how what Canadians can know to help themselves understand what's out there. There's really good tips on what to look for and how to identify suspicious behavior. And so I think that a part of the objective today is to spread those tips and tricks so that we as Canadians can be better informed consumers of all the information that is out there.
Thank you so much. I just had one more question. Do you see any threats from far-right groups in the U.S. To interfere in Canada's election, like the MAGA group?
Vanessa? Thank you for the question. So the site task force and all of its members will continue to monitor the election and any instances of potential foreign interference throughout it. We will look at it from the perspective of foreign interference and violent extremist groups. And in cases where those might intersect, they would certainly come to the attention of our members.
Chris Nardi.
Good afternoon. First of all, thank you for doing this. I've heard it's going to be regular, and it's much appreciated. We rarely have top experts just sitting in front of us, so I really appreciate it. My first question is about the recommendations in the Hogue Inquiry report. Obviously, we'll set aside any that required legislative changes, considering the timing, but which, if any, of the recommendations that didn't require legislative changes do you know of that the government has implemented before this election was launched yesterday?
So maybe I'll start and I'll invite you to join in. Yeah. So some of the ones that we've undertaken right away relate to the communications, and so Justice O recommended we be more forthcoming and more public, and so the panel has done that, and we are doing that through these briefings. Al, are there other recommendations you'd like to speak to?
Yeah, well, you just mentioned the big one, which is increased communications. That's was a prominent theme in the OG report. Other things that she identified that the government has already acted on include things like open source intelligence gathering, which was activated almost immediately after her report with substantial funding increase to the rapid response mechanism, and really an expansion of their mandate so that they could look at the Canadian information scene in a deeper way. That those resources are in place. Similarly, there were recommendations around enforcement of, say, Elections Canada's and the Commission of Canada election legislation. A large input of resources occurred there. Elections Canada got some $44 million over 5 years just to enhance its enforcement capabilities. So that's really the downstream of some of the concerns around, like if you have an issue where you think there's been foreign interference, well, you have to enforce it, and then now we're in a better position to enforce it. So that's an example. I would say, too, that just the changing protocols of the panel are very consistent with the Hogue recommendations. The panel, as Lorianne mentioned, has been in operation now for a year and a half. It's far more established than it was in the last 2 elections. So that is also an example of where there have been improvements. I mean, generally, Justice Hogue's mission of providing a thoughtful report and informing Canadians has been a really important contribution of it in its own right, informing Canadians about their central role. And that's what this conversation is all about as well. So I think that her 51 recommendations are still being ingested by the public service, and there are more recommendations. As you correctly said, some may require legislation, some take a little longer to implement, but we've certainly moved on the ones that we can.
And in terms of site disclosures in particular, you mentioned to Mr. Bronskill that one that we'd seen during, for example, the Liberal leadership campaign could be an example going forward. Now, one could argue that that disclosure was very, very vague and had very little information that ultimately might have cast more aspersion on legitimately content because we had no idea where it was, apart from what platform, what it was about, apart from Ms. Freeland. There was so much that we didn't know. And I'll contrast it to maybe 2 weeks later, Ms. Galadza's RRM put out an incredibly detailed RRM report on the apparent Chinese botnet that had links to content, that had details about what they were spreading, who was spreading it, how to find it, and was ultimately, I would argue, much, much more helpful. So which one are we leaning towards, and will you commit to more disclosure than the one that we saw on Ms. Freeland that a lot of people just told me we don't even know what we're looking for to be concerned about?
So maybe I'll start and then I'll turn it over to Larissa and Vanessa. I think, we want to be as transparent as possible, mindful of there are lots of underpinning things in terms of intelligence that will kind of frame what that transparency is like. It was Larissa's team that did the great work around Ms. Freeland, but maybe Vanessa, I don't know if there's something you want to say, and then Larissa, if you want to add in.
I think what I would add is that where we started our conversation. So the ideal is to be able to pair any of the statements that we make with the tools and techniques that Canadians can apply themselves to be able to evaluate information before them. So I think if there's a takeaway from today, it is really to emphasize how much information the Government of Canada has put out, that it will enable us all to critically evaluate information before us. From the site perspective, we are certainly aware that Proactive and effective information sharing is a really critical element of national security and ensuring our democratic processes. So you will find us, as I said earlier, forward-leaning over the course of the election period to try to share as much information as possible. That said, as Lori mentioned, we need to also keep in mind that national security is paramount. So that does mean that we will not be able to share all information, because we will not share information that, were it to be revealed, could cause injury to national security. Similarly, if we will need to balance the sharing of information with the inadvertent amplification of things that are perhaps having little to minimal impact. And that's probably a good place to hand it over to Larissa.
Thank you. I think you've raised two very good examples, but also examples of where we are still calibrating the right level of detail. It is of utmost importance that our products and our communication with Canadians have credibility. And so we take your comments on board, and this is a team effort that is continuously calibrating the information that we will be proactively putting out to Canadians to inform all of us, and we will, and that has to be done in the context. And each case will be a different context. So that's what governs what will inform our public communications.
If I can pop in as well too, part of it is about those announcements and statements that are made if there is an issue identified. But the other part, and to point to what Vanessa had mentioned about being proactive with information, it's about providing information to all of us who are voters and consuming that information online. And so in the Threats to Democratic Process update that we in the Cyber Center put out, talked a lot about the role artificial intelligence has to play in a lot of these botnets, etc. So trying to get information out proactively so that everyone is informed to make good decisions when they're consuming information online.
We are going to move over to the online portion of the Q&A, but before we do that, I will use my privilege to ask a question from the floor. One of the vulnerabilities that was discussed at length during the OAG Commission was messenger apps and the inability of our security apparatus to tap in either to foreign language messenger apps or just even the ones Canadians might use in English and French. Has there been any change in that posture? Like any greater visibility? Have you spoken to the folks who run WeChat about trying to solve for that a little bit?
Do you want to start us off and then maybe Bridget?
Sure. So we have had conversations with Tencent, which is an affiliate organization of WeChat. And so part of what we've done is we've established that information link with them, and they were part of the exchange on the matter that Larissa described in more detail with Ms. Freeland. And so we do have ongoing discussions with them. They occur both bilaterally and in a multilateral context with other social media platforms. On your specific issue, I mean, we have had a few discussions on that particular point, but there's nothing that we have to announce here today.
Anybody else want to add into it? Melissa?
I would just say that we do have the linguistic capacity to look at messenger apps in different languages. So that's part of you're absolutely right that those there are a lot of consumers in Canada of messenger apps that are actually foreign based. So we have enhanced our capacity to do that for GE45.
But I think the Canadians' expectations would be that those apps are private, though. So maybe can you clarify? Like, are you spying on people's DMs on Instagram, or
There are messenger apps that have newsrooms that are open, and then at a certain point they become closed. We stay at the rapid response mechanism. We're only looking at open source. Social media.
Okay, we'll move online. We'll begin with Nicole Williams from CBC. Hold on one second. I will allow you to talk. Go ahead, Nicole.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering if the panel can first confirm whether or not the Liberals' disqualifying of Chandra Arya had anything to do with concerns of foreign interference.
Vanessa answer?
Or any of the tickets that you or notices from Nylon?
I'm not quite sure who was talking just there. Nicole, we heard the end of your question.
So
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Good.
I'm not sure if that's, I'm going to mute myself so that someone can answer.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the question. Certainly, the Government of Canada takes foreign interference and its potential serious in any context. And this is why, in January, the Deputy Clerk and National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister identified that site would be stood up for the purposes of monitoring the Liberal leadership race. Of course, the leadership campaigns are entirely within the purview of the party. However, they are part of a critical continuum of democratic process activity. So site was stood up on the 27th of January, the day that the candidates were determined by the party, and ran our enhanced monitoring, until actually the 16th of March, a week after the determination of the new leader on March 9th. What I would emphasize there is that throughout the period, the site members had the opportunity to provide classified and unclassified briefs to the Liberal Party in terms of the activity that we saw during that campaign period between the 27th of January and the end of the campaign.
Thank you so much. I'm also wondering if you can speak to whether or not your panel is looking into the comments made by Alberta Premier Danielle Smith on Breitbart. There's speculation, or there's concerns that her suggesting the U.S. administration put tariff talks on pause as potential a potential request by the U.S. to interfere in Canada's elections outcome. I'm wondering if you can comment whether or not that's something your panel is investigating.
Thank you for the question. I think we can say that we're aware of Premier Smith's comments, but that they don't meet the definition of interference, and so we are not looking into them.
And we'll move on to what's going to be our last question of this news conference. Janice McGregor, CBC.
Hi, thanks everyone. A question about the threshold for reporting an incident. You talked about this a little bit. I just want to try and get some more clarity from you on this point. During the inquiry, it was obviously raised the issue of whether something had to be national in scope, or whether we could have an incident at a single riding level that was serious enough that it should be triggering public statements, such that sort of maybe it doesn't sway what party wins, but it might sway who the MP is for a given seat, and that is unacceptable as well. You were sort of talking about how your thinking has changed, how the protocol's been refined given what you learned at the inquiry, but could we now see a warning that is just about something happening in one riding? Your criteria, if you could just lean into it a little bit more and describe it in more detail. I think it's important for people to understand how you've adjusted this threshold based on what the inquiry said.
Yeah, happy to. It's important to distinguish between a panel announcement, which is triggered when something threatens the integrity of the election, and you correctly laid down kind of the polar range, the poles in the range of that. It could be a very impactful level of interference in a single riding, or indeed it could be national. But if it's those sorts of things that threaten the integrity of the election, whether it's in one or just a handful of ridings or across the country, could be something that in the panel's judgment, in their nuanced judgment, requires them to initiate the protocol. And if that were to happen, they would make an announcement to Canadians. At that announcement, they would do a couple of things. They would explain what has happened to the best of their ability, subject to some of the national security concerns that you heard. We're never going to put our human assets at risk. And we're not going to kind of undermine our national security through the announcement, but they will tell Canadians what they can about what has happened, and they will also try to help Canadians understand what they can do to avoid being impacted. So that's the classic panel announcement. And just to be clear, it has never been triggered because it's never had to have been triggered, which is a great thing for Canadian democracy. So as Justice Hogue found in 2019 and 2021, there was no need for the panel to step forward. What Justice Hogue went on to do, and what is impacting kind of what you'll see this time in the 2025 election, is the need to perhaps be a little more proactive in calling out smaller instances, less impactful instances of perhaps mis and disinformation. And the idea is, you know, that transparency is the best sunlight, that this is something that helps Canadians make an informed decision, and that together with the other reports, whether it's the Hogue report, the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians report, the National Security and Intelligence Review Agency report, or we've got the CSIS and CSE reports, that together Canadians can get a fuller picture of mis and disinformation and can properly understand that, you know, they are potentially impacted, and to understand when that impact occurs, how they can protect themselves by not sharing this information and not allowing it to impact their vote, so that Canadians' elections remain for Canadians.
So just to be clear then, it is possible that you would trigger the protocol and make a public statement for a single riding this time. The threshold is no longer that this has to be an event national in scope.
I don't know that that's an actual change. Previous panelists had said that had a single riding been deeply impacted, that would have been enough to trigger the protocol.
I'm just going to ask a final follow-up for clarity on the Chandra Arya element, because it's unclear to me whether you're saying there was a direct linkage between information that site provided to the party and Mr. Arya's disqualification, or you're not commenting on that element of it whatsoever.
Thank you for the request for clarification. So my point was to share with you that the site monitored the Liberal leadership race from when it started, when the candidates were approved by the party, until the end of the campaign, and that we engage with the party in order to be able to share with them information that is helpful for those campaign teams to be alert to instances of foreign interference. And so the types of briefing that we offered to the campaign teams were related to, as we've discussed today, an awareness of the threat landscape, how candidates could protect themselves, and also importantly that we've not touched on today, how to be able to report events that are possibly foreign interference or threats of violent extremism to site. And it's really important to have that two-way communication channel between parties, and it was in place for the leadership race for the first time, and will of course be in place for the general election, as we will establish communication channels with all of the parties through cleared representatives during the course of the general election campaign.
We look forward to future exchanges such as this, and with that we will come to the end of today's press conference. Thank you very much. Merci à tous.